Thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this administration seems to have set a record for the number of agency heads who have wrongly deleted work-related emails, the number of federal employees who have pled the Fifth Amendment to avoid incriminating themselves, and the number of officials who have failed to respond to lawfully served subpoenas. Even in this deplorable company, one agency stands out. The Internal Revenue Service targeted organizations solely on the basis of their conservative views. We expect this kind of behavior from dictatorships and totalitarian governments, not from the United States of America government. It represents a direct attack on freedom of religion, it represents a direct attack on freedom of speech, and thus an attack on our Constitution and our democracy. This corruption of power, continued unrestrained for several years, can only lead to one conclusion. Such conduct is an abuse of office that was condoned by the administration and warrants stiff penalties. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Ohio, Jim Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Koskinen, I'm going to read from the Articles of Impeachment. Page 2, it says, on March 4th, 2014, the Internal Revenue Service magnetically erased 422 backup tapes. Is that statement true?
Yes.
Were you commissioner at the time that these tapes were erased?
Yes.
Was there a subpoena in place for the very information that was erased?
Yes.
More than one subpoena, right? There were two subpoenas.
Well, the subpoenas asked for specific information. The assumption is that some of that information was on those tapes.
Not the assumption. It was on those tapes because it was from the critical time period when Ms. Lerner's hard drive had crashed. Mr. Koskinen, who's Kate Duvall?
Pardon?
Who's Kate Duvall?
Kate Duvall was serving as, counselor to the commissioner.
When we got her bio, it said, counselor to the commissioner, said she advised on high-profile investigations, and she was a member of your senior management team. Is that accurate?
Yes.
In her deposition in front of the Oversight Committee, Ms. Duvall said she learned on February 2nd, 2014, about Lois Lerner's computer crash and missing emails. So on February 2nd, the counselor to the commissioner in senior management working on high-profile investigations learns evidence is missing. And 1 month later, March 4th, the backup tapes that contain this evidence are destroyed. What a coincidence, Mr. Koskinen. 1 month after your top counselor learns Ms. Lerner's hard drive has crashed and there are missing emails, the backup tapes, the secondary source, the primary source is gone, and a month later, the backup tapes are destroyed. Now, here's what's also interesting. Those backup tapes were supposed to have been destroyed months and months beforehand, weren't they, Mr. Koskinen?
Yes, and a large number of them had been destroyed in 2012 and 13.
In fact, you testified to this. You said this. Ms. Lerner, this is testimony in front of the Oversight Committee. You said Ms. Lerner's hard drive had crashed in June 2011. As a result, certain emails could not be retrieved. Recovery tapes containing data for that period no longer existed. False statement, they did, but they were supposed to have been erased. This data was retained on tapes for only 6 months. So they were supposed to have been erased actually 2 years prior to the date that they were, but they somehow survived. They somehow survived, and then exactly 1 month, 30 days after your top counselor, Kate Duvall, in senior management learns that the primary source, the emails, are missing, these backup tapes that have survived for 2 years suddenly get destroyed. And we're supposed to believe that's just a coincidence? That just happened by chance?
The Inspector General spent a year looking into exactly that subject and came up with the conclusion after interviewing over 50 witnesses that that was totally a mistake by 2 employees on the midnight shift in Martinsburg.
The old midnight shift guys in Martinsburg excuse.
Well,
okay.
That's
okay.
the IG's report after a year.
Okay. Well, let me read one other statement to you again from the Articles of Impeachment. This is on page 3, Article 2. On June 20th, 2014, Commissioner Koskinen testified, quote, since the start of this investigation, every email has been preserved, nothing has been lost, nothing has been destroyed. Is that statement true, Mr. Koskinen?
At the time, that was what I had been informed, what I believed. A year later, or 9 months.
It could not have been true at the time because that said the date is June 20th, 2014.
That's correct.
And you just told me on March 4th, the first question I asked you, on March 4th, 3 months before that, March 4th, 2014, that the IRS had destroyed 422 backup tapes.
That's correct.
So how is this statement true that you made under oath to a congressional committee?
The statement was not correct in light of that evidence, which I did
So
not
the
know.
statement wasn't true?
A statement I thought was true. It was not true on the basis of the evidence that we discovered later.
Mr. Chairman, this is the problem. You think about any of the folks we represent, any of the constituents I represent in the 4th District of Ohio has this same fact pattern where they lose documents and then a month later, they're being audited by the IRS, they lose documents, a month later they destroy the backup disk, and it's fine, they can get away with that. This is what so many Americans are frustrated about, this double standard. Mr. Koskinen can lose documents, the IRS can lose documents, then destroy the backup source, the backup tapes, and nothing happens. Any American that happens to them, they're in big trouble, and everybody knows it. We're not asking to, all we're asking is this guy no longer hold this office. That's all we're asking, and in light of this fact pattern, I think that's the least we can do. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman from Texas has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your opening statement, you mentioned reviewing thousands of pages of documents related to these charges. Does the committee majority have access to the unedited transcripts of interviews conducted by the Oversight Committee?
You should direct your questions to the witness.
I'm directing my question to the chairman. Parliamentary inquiry. And please stop the clock. It's a parliamentary inquiry.
We do not think so.
You
But
do not think that the majority has access?
No.
Well, I would request that the minority, at least, if the majority wishes, that's your prerogative, that I would request the minority have access to these documents.
the chair will take your request under advisement as we ascertain whether or not your question is answered in the affirmative. If so, then we obviously think it should be.
Well, we're going forward with impeachment hearings that are the purview of this committee. I think this committee ought to see all the relevant evidence, but that's self-evident. Let me just say, before I ask Mr. Koskinen some questions, that Mr. Jordan's questions, wasn't this true then? Yes. Did you know it was true then? No. Did you tell the truth then as you knew it? Yes. That fact pattern shows nothing about impeachment, obviously. All it shows is that he didn't know at the time he was asked the question. He told the truth as he then knew it. Mr. Koskinen, thank you, Commissioner, thank you for being here. The Senate Finance Committee, the Department of Justice, and the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration have all looked into the accusations against you, and each of them has independently concluded there is no evidence to support these charges. Your critics have not made their case, nor do they have the votes to force impeachment on the House floor, and these proceedings are an obvious sham. But because you are an expert on tax policy, I do think it serves some purpose to shed some light on how you, as the IRS Commissioner, understand some of the work of the IRS. If someone, is there anything that would prohibit someone from releasing their tax returns if they want to because they're under audit?
No.
Thank you. Now, President Nixon discloses tax returns while under IRS audit. Have the rules changed since then?
No.
Can an individual use other people's money run through a charitable foundation to enrich himself or satisfy his personal debts or obligations?
The rules are that would be personal inurement. No tax-exempt organization can benefit, use its funds to benefit any, in effect, insider.
Would the following factors affect the tax exemption of a foundation? If an individual used funds from his charitable foundation to purchase a $12,000 football helmet for himself, signed by Tim Tebow, if an individual used $20,000 from the foundation to pay for a 6-foot-tall portrait of himself, if an individual used $100,000 of the foundation's money to cover part of a legal settlement after a dispute with the municipal government, or if he used $158,000 to settle a dispute with a disgruntled participant at a celebrity golf tournament, were any of those actions using tax-exempt foundation monies improper, and if so, would they jeopardize the tax exemption of the foundation?
I can't comment on individual
I'd like you
cascades.
to answer the question, sir.
I object to the question in that it's outside the scope of this hearing. Additionally, it's outside the scope and expertise of the witness.
That's not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Rules of the committee would permit the gentleman to ask the question, and the commissioner is requested to answer it.
Clearly, the general rules are understood that a 501c's assets should not be used to benefit either a major contributor or anyone operating the entity. The particular facts and circumstances of any case would need to be reviewed carefully and accurately.
Obviously, but if those were the facts that I just said, would they be improper?
All I can tell you is that the rules are clear, and it would be up to a set of people who do this regularly at the IRS to investigate and make a determination as to whether, in fact, the tax exemption of that organization was still viable.
Commissioner, in your opinion, if a fact pattern like this one were brought to the attention of the IRS and the IRS failed to investigate it, would that be a dereliction of duty or even an impeachable offense?
The Commissioner does not make a determination as to about any audit or investigation. We get referrals, suggestions, sometimes might review urgings to look into a wide range of activities of not only tax-exempt organizations but others. Those are referred to a detailed process internally, and it's not my role to make that determination.
Thank you. I have one last question, and that is, at the time you were appointed by the President, why did he ask you to come out of retirement and appoint you to the head of the IRS? What mission? What did he say? What mission did he give you?
Actually, I did not talk to the President personally. I talked to Secretary Liu, who I knew from years ago, and White House personnel. And the reason I was asked was obvious. The IRS had made a terrible management mistake. I've spent 45 years of my career managing organizations under stress, including in the private sector and the public sector. And it was obvious to me, just reading the paper, that there was a problem that needed to be fixed, and I was honored to be asked and pleased to undertake the responsibility.
Thank you very much. My time has expired.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, everybody's afraid of the IRS, and no wonder. They can make your life a living hell if they want to. That's why it's so important that they play it straight, that they don't play favorites, that they don't play politics. Well, back in the years leading up to Barack Obama's reelection in 2012, the IRS did play politics. It intensely scrutinized conservative organizations, especially if they had the words T and party in their title, and all but refused to grant them tax-exempt status. At the same time, the IRS freely granted such status to liberal organizations. Why would they do this? To give Barack Obama and his liberal allies the advantage in the upcoming election. And who ordered it? Well, Lois Lerner was the head of the exempt organizations unit of the IRS. She ordered it. But who above her told her to do it? And did it go all the way to the White House? We'll never know, because she destroyed the evidence, then took the fifth, and then the Obama Justice Department refused to prosecute her and find out the answers to these important questions. In many ways, this is a lot like what Hillary Clinton did. She destroyed the evidence. Evidence of her emails was sought by the FBI and by congressional committees. Rather than comply, she had her emails destroyed, and she lied about it. She even had the devices that stored the emails, multiple BlackBerries and iPads, destroyed, some with a hammer. Yet the Obama administration, Justice Department, refused to prosecute her too. So, Mr. Commissioner, where do you come in? Well, when the selective targeting of conservative groups by the IRS story broke, President Obama feigned outrage, said the targeting was inexcusable, and declared that we needed, quote, new leadership that can help restore confidence going forward, unquote. So President Obama brought you in to head the IRS, supposedly to clean up the mess. Arguably, Commissioner Koskinen, you made matters worse. How? Well, you testified before congressional committees on multiple occasions. You made a number of important statements before Congress, which turned out to be completely false, even though you were under oath. For example, in referring to Lois Lerner's emails, you stated, quote, since the start of this investigation, every email has been preserved, nothing has been lost, nothing has been destroyed, unquote. This turned out to be completely untrue, of course. Lerner had tens of thousands of emails destroyed, and when you learned of this, rather than inform Congress, you failed to notify Congress for 4 months. Why in the world did you wait 4 months?
Actually, I waited 2 months. I was advised of this situation in April, and the reason I waited, because I instructed people we needed to find as many of the emails from that period of the hard drive crash as we could. We found and produced 24,000 Lois Lerner emails from the period of her hard drive crash. She did not destroy information thereafter. We produced another 50,000 emails, so the investigators, all 6 of them, had 78,000 Lois Lerner emails from the period of 2009 to 2013.
Well, I would submit that you had a duty to inform Congress immediately when you learned that. But let me move on, because I've only got a minute
and I would
and a half to
agree.
go.
I have said that in retrospect, if I had it to do over again in April, I would have contacted and advised Congress immediately. There was the delay didn't change any investigation, but I can understand the aggravation it caused in some areas. And if I had to do again, I would actually advise the Congress that the hard drive, I knew the hard drive had crashed and had been advised of that. We were now going to try, as we did, to produce all the emails we could from that period, and we actually produced 24,000.
Thank you. Let me move on. Similarly, after you learned of the destruction of Lois Lerner's emails, you testified that the IRS went to great lengths to try to resurrect her emails by other means. This, too, turned out to be false. You and the IRS did very little to recover those destroyed emails. In fact, experts testified that there were 6 ways the IRS could have tried to reacquire the emails. You failed to even try 5 of the 6 techniques. You failed to look at the IRS's own backup tapes. You failed to look at the server. You failed to look at the backup server. You failed to look at the loaner laptop. And you even failed to look at Lois Lerner's BlackBerry. So you really did very little to comply with that. My time's running out, so let me just say this. What really makes me mad about this whole sorry episode is that the IRS subpoenas information from taxpayers all the time. And if the average taxpayer exercised the same lack of cooperation that the IRS displayed in this matter, that taxpayer would be in a world of trouble. That taxpayer would undoubtedly have been prosecuted, likely convicted, and likely would have spent time behind bars. But in this case, it was the Obama administration's powerful IRS that got caught with its hand in the cookie jar. And you circled the wagons and clammed up, and you took the fifth, and you destroyed evidence and betrayed the country. And most sadly, got away with it. And my time's expired, so I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am really astonished by some of the reckless statements that have been made this morning, but let me just go to the Commissioner. You're under oath right now, right? You have to tell us the truth.
Yes.
And we've had an IG report basically pointing out that when you testified before to a congressional committee, you told the truth as you knew it at the time, and later there was information that you didn't know that came out that you sent to us. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I guess my question, if you take a look at the Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, it says the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, I realize you're not here as an expert on constitutional law, but you are a lawyer and you went to a very fine law school. Can you tell me which element of that, treason, bribery, or other high crime and misdemeanor that you've committed?
My position and that of my lawyers is I have not committed any of those crimes. But again, I recognize this committee's already heard from constitutional experts, and it's this committee's decision.
No, I understand that, but I just think this is a trumped-up type of thing. I just think it's, having worked on many impeachments in the past, this doesn't even pass the smell test. This is absurd. I would like to also ask, since you're here and we're not on the Financial Services Committee, is it within the authority of the Commissioner to suspend an audit of a taxpayer during the course of a presidential campaign so that that taxpayer who felt that they were constrained in the release of their audit would then feel okay to release it?
The IRS Commissioner has no authority over any individual audit or even the determination of whether an audit should begin, and I think that's appropriate.
Let me ask you whether or not, I know that everything that the IRS does is private, and that the staff takes that very seriously, and I think we all appreciate that. But let me ask you this. If an audit had been terminated, would the commissioner or the agency be allowed to say publicly that there was, in fact, no audit going on of a taxpayer?
We never would do comment about any taxpayer situation, the status of whether they're under audit, whether the audit's continuing, or whether it's concluded. That's all taxpayer information that's protected.
So even if there was nothing going on, if somebody was lying about that, they just get away with the lie?
We would never comment on any taxpayer's situation with regard to audits or filings or what was in that information.
I'd like to talk about whether or not, if someone took money from a foreign government, say Russia, and then decided as a candidate or an elected official to go easy on our opponent, would that, if they were elected, an elected official, would that fall into the realm in the Constitution of bribery or treason?
I'm not in a position to make a comment on that.
Well, I just think that, you know, one of the things that should concern this committee is the fact that one of our candidates for president has failed to provide transparency on his financial situation by releasing his tax returns, as every other candidate has this time and has for many, many decades. It leads to questions on the role that Russia is playing in his business, what that may lead him to do in terms of his extraordinary comments of praise for the Russian leader, who is a virtual dictator and certainly an adversary of the United States. And I would hope that this committee might use some time to explore that possibility and to see if we couldn't get that candidate to do the right thing and let the American people know that he isn't compromised financially with Russia and the foreign power who is causing so much problems in the world, in the Balkans, in Syria, and certainly elsewhere around the world. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll refrain from asking about large nonprofits that might have taken and been influenced by foreign government contributions. That would be too sensitive to Mrs. Clinton. Commissioner, our founding fathers did consider maladministration for impeachment, and they decided that that was too low. Do you know of that from your readings?
That's my understanding.
And so I want to ask very much along that. Misdemeanors are in, maladministration is out. Now, I represent Camp Pendleton and 47,000 Marines. Maladministration is what you get fired for if you're a colonel, a captain, a sergeant, or even a general. And that includes loss of confidence in being able to do the job, failure to essentially get your subordinates to follow your orders, failure to show the kind of zealous obedience for compliance with rules, regulations, and laws. These are two different standards, the standard between impeachment and the standard for relieving a senior officer or even a sergeant in the military. So I want to go through this because I think at a minimum we should have a discussion about what actually occurred. You were under a subpoena. You were aware that we were looking for documents. You assured the Oversight Committee that you were using absolutely every possible tool to recover them. And so now the question, in retrospect, did you fail to use every tool? Did you fail to ask the kinds of questions of enough people, enough experts, to know that the BlackBerry that was still existed at the time of the investigation would have had many of these lost emails, that the servers, the tapes, and other documents could have been recovered, as you eventually discovered. Would you say that that is a failure of yours that you will have to live with?
No, we clearly failed. The BlackBerry was actually in the control of the IG from 2013 on. But as I've stated, we clearly failed in areas of preservation of documents, and I've said that was a mistake, and it was driven by the fact that we were spending, and I was told the group were looking every place they thought they would find the emails. We found 1,300,000 pages of documents that were produced. It took us a year to do that, and that was where people thought the most likely places was to come. The IG, in his review of everything else, found another 1,000 emails, a number of which were in the early 2000s, long before this held. But those 1,000 emails, if we'd had the technique and the time, would have been important to produce. But I would remind you that we did produce a phenomenal volume of stuff with 250 people working every day. And from my standpoint, my commitment and order and instruction to people was to do everything possible to produce information for the committee as fast as we could and as thoroughly as we could.
Thank you. I would ask unanimous consent that the 226-page report chronicling the actions be placed in the record from the Oversight Committee.
Without objection, they will be made a part of the record.
Commissioner, you know, obviously, if we had to do this over again, we would all ask that it be done differently. But I'm going to use the remainder of my time to ask you a more serious question. In light of the fact that agency heads generally make the decisions about subpoenas coming from Congress, and they lack, as you lack, in spite of all your experience, the expertise to know where to go, how to preserve documents, where if you will, all the places to make sure, the 6 different areas that could have been looked at and according to the IG were not looked at, 5 of them. Do you think that Congress should insist on having a contact and responsible person in each agency that in fact could be held accountable because they had the expertise and could be reasonably expected to have the authority to enforce and deliver documents on behalf of lawfully submitted subpoenas?
That's an interesting suggestion that I don't have the authority to respond to, but it would be helpful to reaffirm the commitment that we had at the IRS, which is if Congress asks, not whether subpoena or not, if Congress asks for information, we have an obligation to provide it as quickly as we can, as thoroughly as we can. And that's an obligation, as I say, it doesn't take a subpoena. That's an obligation we have to the Congress anytime you ask us for a question.
In my last few seconds, Lois Lerner was referred for a criminal indictment by the Ways and Means Committee under a statute that said that the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia shall present to a grand jury, and the administration failed to do that. In retrospect, when the American people expect somebody to be held accountable for the wrongful targeting of conservative groups, wouldn't it have gone a long way if the Justice Department had simply complied with the law rather than chose not to comply with the law?
I can't speak for the Justice Department, but I can, as you know, remind you that from the commissioner on down, the acting commissioner on down, all 5 levels of people responsible in this area are no longer with the government. They're no longer with the IRS. They, in fact, no longer have their jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank you very much, Commissioner, and let me apologize for your presence here today. I realize that you have made a commitment as a public servant, but I think it's appropriate to apologize to you for what I believe is a non-serious effort as relates to the Constitution and the impeachment criteria. Saying that, let me take note of your language in your statement, which says, I will do my best today to answer your questions, and I'm committed to full cooperation. That means listening and responding to feedback and criticism, acknowledging mistakes, and working diligently to improve. Do you still adhere to that statement in your testimony?
I do.
So you're committed as a public servant to ensure that we get all the information that we need to have. Is that not correct?
That is correct. I spent 4 years on the Senate side as the Chief of Staff to a senator who ultimately chaired the Oversight Committee in the Senate, and I fully understand and appreciate and think it's appropriate for agencies to respond as quickly as they can with all of the information requested.
Thank you, Commissioner, very much. Let me put into the record a statement. The Senate Finance Committee, Department of Justice, and the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration found 3 points related to you, Commissioner. And that is that you had not misled Congress, you had not allowed evidence to be destroyed, at least it was not attributable to you, and you were not considered to have obstructed oversight of the IRS. Do you still believe that those were true about your actions as a commissioner?
I do.
Let me also put into the record a letter dated September 14th where a direct question was asked to the Treasury Inspector General. No evidence was uncovered that any IRS employees have been directed to destroy or hide information from Congress, the DOJ, or the TIGTA. That letter was written by 2 members of Congress on September 14, 2016. A letter came back from Mr. Russell, J. Russell George, Inspector General, and I quote, it says, and its conclusion, I received your letter, and its conclusion that no evidence was uncovered that any IRS employees have been directed to destroy or hide information from Congress, the DOJ, or TIGTA. In your letter, you specifically asked, since issuing this report, has your office changed its previous conclusion on this matter? At this time, no additional information has been uncovered that changes our conclusion in this report. I ask unanimous consent to put this in the record. Commissioner, do you adhere to that letter from the
Without
Inspector General?
objection, the document will be made a part of the record.
You have seen such reports from the Inspector General, have you not?
Yes.
And do you adhere or at least understand that that is being said about IRS employees, which would include yourself?
Yes.
Right. Was Ms. Lerner at the IRS when you arrived?
No, she was gone. I've never actually met her or talked to her.
Are you still engaging in be on the lookout activities?
We have not used beyond the lookout activity numbers for 3 years or longer.
I think it's also important to note, again, that this is not an impeachment hearing, and even though many of our members are inquiring in that manner, it is not. And it also is important to note that experts have said that we have not given you due process. I hope as we proceed to eliminate this proceeding, meaning to cease and desist, that if we do not, that you'll have due process. Let me proceed with some questions regarding the time that you've come after February 2014. What efforts have you made to be constructive and to provide information to members of Congress?
Across the board, I've made a commitment that we will respond to every request. I will personally respond to every letter within 30 days, if at all possible, and I will explain if not. As a general matter, over 90% of inquiries get a response from me within 90 days. We have not refused to provide any information. We are anxious across the board. The IRS affects every taxpayer in the country.
Commissioner,
important for us to be transparent.
Thank you. And in this proceeding dealing with impeachment, if it's not high crimes and misdemeanor, there are elements that our friends believe that would suggest that you would be subjected to impeachment proceedings. And so is there anything that you've done that can show deliberate bad faith? You're a lawyer. You're allowed to say that you think this action or that action. Is there any action that may have done so?
As I've said, it was not a perfect process. There are things that, again, in retrospect.
When you made mistakes, you owned up to it. Is that correct?
And basically, there's nothing that I feel and no evidence that I have actually acted in bad faith, given anybody instruction.
And
not
you've
to
offered
comply.
information when you found the information after the fact.
And when we found the information, in fact, we spent a lot of time. Again, I should have told Congress
let me
earlier. But we
ask you
spent
this.
time finding the 24,000.
Let me ask you this, Commissioner. I'm sorry for talking over you. I'm just trying to get in. Is it appropriate for a foundation to give political donations out of the foundation, a 501c3 foundation?
501c3 organizations, foundations, otherwise, are not allowed to participate in politics.
I thank you very much, Commissioner, and I believe an apology is owed to you, and I believe that there are no grounds, if we were to move in that direction, for any form of impeachment. We need to thank you for your service. Continue to do the good work that you're doing, working on behalf of the American people, and answering questions from Congress in the normal oversight responsibilities. Thank you, and I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes, for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Commissioner, thank you for being here. As we sit here today, just bringing a little common sense to this, a vast majority of Americans believe today that our country's headed in the wrong direction, and they want us the people elected by them, just to fix it. And I want to go on record as saying I don't apologize for trying to fix it. And when I look here and I recognize that a vast majority of Americans no longer trust their government, that creates a crisis of confidence in our government, and they have a good reason to believe that. And I don't apologize for asking how we fix that. When I see gag orders issued by the Pentagon where they don't even allow individuals over there to testify or meet with members of Congress, we see evidence that's being destroyed, we see misrepresentation of facts to Congress, that's something we should come together and try to fix. And so everybody's asked you what's appropriate, testimony from the other side. So I want to ask you this. What do you feel is appropriate as the IRS commissioner? Should you be held to a lower standard than the taxpayer subject to your jurisdiction, a higher standard, or the same standard? What do you think is appropriate for us to hold you to?
I think I, like any public servant, should be held to the higher standards of probity. We should cooperate.
Should you be held to at least an equal standard to taxpayers that are subject to your jurisdiction?
Yes, I think we should be held to that standard or even higher.
And if that's the case, wouldn't you agree that if a taxpayer were sitting where you were sitting with the same responses that you are given, that that taxpayer would be in a lot of trouble before the Internal Revenue Service? And let me just throw this out to you. If the facts show that you lied to Congress, I'm not saying they did, if they show that you lied to Congress or that you mismanaged your office, what do you believe is appropriate for Congress to do to try to fix it? You've already said you don't think that impeachment is the right thing. What do you think is appropriate? Should we just do nothing and let that continue? Or do we just keep coming back in here and saying, oh, we're not going to do it again?
No, I think I've never objected to any of the hearings. I've had over
I'm not talking
close
about
to 40
the hearings. I'm talking about the conclusions from the hearing.
Conclusions.
What do you think? You said that you didn't think impeachment was inappropriate. Mr. Jordan said he didn't think you should continue to hold that office. If a taxpayer were here, you said you should be held to the same standard as that taxpayer.
And if a
that taxpayer would have been had to pay the IRS.
If the taxpayer provided us information truthfully, did the best they could to produce information, and found that information was missing, the first thing we do with that taxpayer is try to help them reconstruct those records.
Wait a minute. You're not going to tell me that if a taxpayer comes to you and has filed a faulty tax return and then just says, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was the case, that you're going to let him off the hook?
No, he's got to pay the taxes he owes. The question is whether...
What do you owe for misrepresenting something to Congress? And let me just say this to you, Mr. Commissioner. What incentive is it when you come here to testify before us, if you can consistently just say, I don't know? Isn't it a great incentive for you not to do due diligence to find out? You could have told the committee, I don't know, but when you make an affirmative statement, doesn't that put you under some responsibility to have made sure you've ascertained that? And the second thing, my friends on the other side of the aisle consistently love to say they didn't find any affirmative action that you did to order that information would be impeded from going to Congress. Don't you have an affirmative duty to do everything you can to make sure that doesn't take place?
And duty to make sure the agency functions well, that doesn't take place to the extent I can control it.
In hindsight, did you do everything you could do to find out if you were making accurate statements before Congress? And did you do everything you could do to make sure that evidence getting to Congress wasn't being impeded?
I do in retrospect. The erasure of those tapes was not known until well after my hearings.
That's not my question.
My question the answer is I couldn't tell the committee things I didn't know. All I could tell the committee in honesty and good faith was what I knew. And what I knew is what I told the committee. When later information, a year later in terms of the tapes came out, I said that was a mistake and we should be...
Did you do everything within your power to find that information? You said you were given assurances. You know, is that what you just relied on, that one person told you that?
No, we have a large number of executives that I have great confidence in, and when they tell me that, in fact, they're doing their best to produce all of the relevant evidence...
So you just can rely on those experts to tell you that, and that's enough for you. And I just close by saying, Mr. Chairman, the Commissioner says he should be the same standard as the taxpayer. If a taxpayer was sitting there, Mr. Commissioner, I think you know he'd be in a world of hurt. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman, recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And firstly, I welcome you. I know you'd rather be other places, and I probably wish you were other places too. But you're here. And this has all the trappings of impeachment, and that's kind of a sexy thing, so to speak, in political parlance. But the constitutional standard for impeachment that this committee considers is high crimes or misdemeanors, and I know that's been discussed today. The question is not whether you, Commissioner, have been a perfect administrator, and I'm not saying you haven't. That's a question for the Ways and Means Committee to decide, and they oversee the IRS, and for the President who appointed you, not for this committee. The question we're called upon in this context to decide whether there have been high crimes or misdemeanors that warrant the extraordinary constitutional remedy of impeachment. And that would be high crimes or misdemeanors that you have committed, not that maybe people think your office or your predecessors committed. We heard in our last hearing that although high crimes and misdemeanors need not be limited to criminal acts, the Commissioner's critics still need to show that he acted with some deliberate bad faith. They have not done so, and every other investigator who looked at these facts, the Treasury, Inspector General, the Department of Justice, and the Senate Finance Committee have reached the same conclusion. So it's regretful that you're here, but since you're here, I want to ask you this. Has the Internal Revenue Service been funded adequately to perform its job of catching tax cheats, and by catching tax cheats and or the threat thereof, gotten the revenues that are necessary to provide the services that government should be rendering?
No.
How much has the IRS budget been cut recently?
The IRS budget since 2010 has been cut $900 million, even as we have 10 million more taxpayers and a wide range of statutory mandates to implement.
And about being cut $900 million? Is that what you said?
Yes, $900 million over. Our budget today is $900 million less than it was 6 years ago.
Has anybody taken that figure and said that when you cut the IRS $900 million, how much revenue is lost because of the lack of ability to audit?
We estimate and have provided that information to Congress that we are leaving $5 billion a year on the table, and it's not a guess as to we might find people. It's $5 billion in audits that we can't undertake when we know there are difficulties.
So we've cut $900 million. We haven't saved $900 million. We've lost $4.1 billion?
Correct.
Does that contribute to the deficit?
Yes.
And if you cut IRS by that much money, and y'all are kind of the whipping boy of my friends on the other side of the aisle who don't like or think that government services are so necessary, the government has to fund entitlements, quote unquote. So if you don't have the money and we lose $4.1 billion, we're hurting the person at the bottom. People that need government assistance is not an entitlement, whether it's be SNAP payments or it's energy, LIHEAP, folks not getting through the winters without freezing or not getting enough food for their children, our public schools or maybe even public health, the CDC and the NIH, which is looking for cures for cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and heart disease and stroke and all the other diseases that are going to come and get each and every one of us one day. Those folks are getting hurt. When they attack you, they are attacking the NIH, they are attacking the CDC, they are attacking people who need SNAP payments for ease hunger and their children, and WIC payments, and public education and public health. Is that not true?
Well, I'm not an expert where the money would go, but clearly there's less money to be provided or appropriated or to cut the deficit.
Well, it's just incredulous to me. You've done nothing to warrant this hearing. But your office is under attack because government is under attack, and the government that's under attack is the government takes care of the poorest and the least of these, those that are be the most precious in the eyes of people who look at humanity as at a sight of seeing how we treat others, and if we treat others as we should treat ourselves, and could follow the golden rule, and that's unfortunate. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioner, I thank you for coming here to testify. I think this important discussion this country is having right now about our reliability within our government agencies. And the first question from me would be, did Lois Lerner have any kind of a software package or any kind of electronic search that excluded or identified the conservative groups that far outweighed the non-conservative groups that asked for the not-for-profit status?
Yes, clearly all of this started with the IG report noting that he called it improper criteria. They were totally improper criteria were used to select organizations applying for C4 designation for further review. Those organizations predominantly were conservative organizations.
Was it an electronic system that sorted out these applications? Was there any database, any matrix of any kind, any paperwork of any kind other than a stack of applications?
Now, my understanding is that there were ultimately developed beyond the lookout list for organizations with these names in their titles, and some of those were progressive names, but the bulk of the applications were conservative, and it was that list, that beyond the lookout list of any organization with these names in their title, had nothing to do with whatever their political philosophies or views were. It was if their name was in the title,
and who
they should then be
generated
selected
that
for review.
Be on the lookout?
Pardon?
Who generated that be on the lookout memo?
It actually was, I'm not an expert in what happened before I got there, but my understanding was it was a back and forth by people at in Lois Lerner's office as well as the front line trying to figure out how do we handle these. And that list was developed, and there was an attempt to stop using the list, and then the list got used again.
And we know that the IG confirmed the targeting that had taken place as well. I'd ask you, have there been any firings, dismissals? Have you identified anyone within the IRS that had violated law or policy or protocol in such a way that it was worthy of termination?
As I noted, all of this happened well before I got there, is why I'm here. But as I stated, starting with the acting commissioner down, everyone in that chain of command is gone.
Everybody in the chain of command is gone. Were there any remaining culprits within the IRS today?
None that anybody has pointed out that had a responsibility. The leadership and the responsibility are gone.
And if you identified them, that would be your duty going forward as well?
Yes.
And then I'd like to take you to Martinsburg, and having a little trouble understanding that. And that is, there were 424 tapes that were discovered at storage in Martinsburg in a shipping center that I view as a warehouse of about 1,900 square feet. I know about how big that is. And so that night shift decided they would scrub those tapes, 422 of the 424 successfully. And can you explain to this committee how long it would take to process 422 tapes?
I don't know, but I assume it's a relatively prompt process. I would note the tapes actually had been sent to Martinsburg. They originally were in New Carrollton, and they were actually, a bulk of related tapes had been erased a couple of years before that. These were the remaining tapes. They were in a closet. The IG said they were identified as junk, and they were sent.
Do they process them one tape at a time or multiple tapes in batches?
That I don't understand. I don't know, but I think they're one at a time.
I think that's important, because how long would it take you to put a tape in, scrub it, even if it's a couple of minutes to do so, and another, and to get 422 of them done in an 8-hour night shift? Do you know the names of the individuals that process those tapes?
I do.
And they're still working for the IRS?
I can't talk about personnel, but the IG investigated them, clearly provided a report, and I can't say anything more.
But I'm not asking you for their names. I'm just saying, are they still working for the IRS?
My understanding is at least one of them is. But the IG noted it was an honest mistake, and we turned it over to our people to review it, and that personnel review went on. But the IG said they had made an honest mistake. It was not anything intentional on their part. They certainly didn't mean to interfere with anything going on.
The IG in their testimony before Congress seemed to be a bit incredulous that this string of coincidences could be put together in that fashion and have the voids and the vacancies of information that we have. I just reflect on this, Commissioner, is that if I would take the timeline of the IRS activities throughout this thing, and there are many of them sitting around in this committee today, and I'd overlay that over the timeline of the things that went on with Watergate, which one, I'll ask you, which one do you think would sound more improbable?
Again, that's a judgment I guess people could make. I think when there's a 17-minute gap and no intervening information provided, that's more significant than when there are tapes erased and 24,000 emails are provided from that same period. If we had some information about that conversations on the 17-minute gap, they'd be more comparable, but there was no information there. It was all lost here. The IG said 24,000 emails, but only 10,000 of them were from the gap period. And in that gap period, we produced 24,000, twice as many emails from Lois Lerner.
I would submit the opposite conclusion myself, but I thank you, Commissioner, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing has been noticed as a hearing on impeachment articles referred on John Koskinen, Part 3. There are no impeachment articles, and this is not an impeachment hearing. This hearing is therefore simply a total sham. The impeachment process cannot begin until the 435 members of the House of Representatives adopt a resolution authorizing the House Judiciary Committee to conduct an independent investigation. Such a resolution has not been presented to or passed by the House, rendering today's hearing a misnamed farce. This committee does a grave injustice to the committee as a hallowed institution by being complicit in the perpetuation of this sham proceeding. There is a reason for a careful process when it comes to the most drastic action of impeachment. It's called due process. The effort to impeach IRS Commissioner John Koskinen is without precedent in the history of the United States. The House has impeached executive branch officials only 3 times, and it has never impeached a sub-cabinet official. The so-called impeachment resolutions contain clear errors of fact, misleading statements, and baseless conclusions. The Commissioner has repeatedly asked for immediate access to the transcripts of all interviews conducted by the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee during its investigation. They are necessary to answer basic questions about the scope and depth of that committee's investigation, such as what witnesses were interviewed, what questions were asked, what leads were followed, and whether all relevant information was disclosed. But again, I would tell you that this committee has conducted no such investigation, the House Judiciary Committee. This is a drastic departure from our previous process, and it's depriving Commissioner Koskinen of his due process rights. You know, there are many basic reasons for there to be due process applicable to this particular proceeding with the errors that are and the misleading statements and baseless conclusions that riddle the so-called charging document. It's due process that requires Commissioner Koskinen to be allowed to make objections to any evidence, to cross-examine each witness that the resolution's proponents put forward, to call his own witnesses, to expose what he believes to be blatant factual errors in the resolution. And then after due process allowed for the submission of the evidence against him and his ability to confront that evidence, present his own evidence, have that evidence subject to confrontation by the accuser, it then would fall to the reasoned and sober intellect of this committee to determine whether or not impeachment was in fact warranted, which is a very drastic action. Again, only taking place 3 times in the history of this country. So what we're doing today, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I know, the American people know, is just playing politics. We got other things that we should be dealing with. The Zika virus, funding for it, funding for the Flint fiasco that has been unremediated for the last year. So many things for this Congress to do, passing a budget, keeping the government open. We're approaching another deadline, September 30th. No continuing resolution, no omnibus, no appropriations bills passed, nothing. And here we are 3 or 4 days before we adjourn, so that these members who talk so badly about the institution of government can go home to get reelected so they can come back next year and do nothing. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time.